So hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Fletcher. I am the Programs and Engagement Coordinator here at the Haley Public Library. Tonight, our presentation is Skiing Sun Valley, a history from Union Pacific to the Holdings with historian John Lundin. So John Lundin is a lawyer, historian, and author who has lectured extensively about the Wood River Valley's history. He is a founding member of the Washington State Ski and Snowboard Museum at Snoqualmie Pass, Washington, and works with the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. He is the author of several books, including the award-winning Early Skiing on Snoqualmie Pass, which he wrote in 2017, Sun Valley, Ketchum, and the Wood River Valley, A History, which he wrote in 2020, and his most recent book, Skiing Sun Valley, A History from Union Pacific to the Holdings. His long-term project is a history of the Wood River Valley based on the experiences of his family, who moved to the Bellevue area in 1881, attracted by the Silver Strike, and were early pioneers of this area. So love to give a virtual welcome to, I forgot one thing, is I always like to feature a book that we have here at the library. And so, of course, the book that I'm featuring tonight is Skiing Sun Valley that John wrote. You'll see that this is just a piece of paper because his book has been checked out since we got it. So it has wonderful historic images, and it really goes into a lot of detail that he's not able to do in an hour and a half. So I highly recommend that you check it out from our library. So John, you can unmute yourself, and we are ready to hear more about the history of skiing in Sun Valley. So I can't hear you yet. You'll need to click that little microphone in the lower left-hand corner.
How is that?
That sounds perfect, yes.
And then I do share screen.
Yep.
Whoops, that didn't do it.
No, it didn't.
New share.
You might start. Okay.
Here we go.
And then
a few technical issues to work on. Sorry about this. Resume slideshow.
There you go. It looks perfect. It looks just great.
Great. Okay. I guess we're set.
Yep. Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for joining us. This is the new reality, I guess, a Zoom talk rather than one in person. I'll have to say that I've done a series of lectures in the Valley here, and I really miss the communication with the live audience. There's a synergy and feedback that's really irreplaceable, but this is the new reality. And frankly, it sure makes it easy. I'm sitting in my house. You're all in your houses. You can grab the beverage of your choice as we go through. And so some form of this will probably continue in the future. I'm going to talk about actually both of my new books relating to the Wood River Valley. You can see the covers of both of them here. And they're really companion books because they trace the history and economic history of the Wood River Valley from the earliest days of mining up through sheep and agriculture. And the key piece that linked those with the ultimate founding of Sun Valley was the railroad. And without that history that kept the railroad, that brought it in and kept it going, there would be no Sun Valley here. Let me start at the beginning and tell you a bit about why this trial lawyer from Seattle is talking to you. As Christian mentioned, my great-grandparents moved here in 1881. They moved to Bellevue. They built the International Hotel, which is pictured right here on the main street of Bellevue in 1882. And that was the large, fancy facility in the Wood River Valley. This is the McFall family in 1888, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. And my grandmother was born in 1890, so she's not in this picture. These are her sisters and brother. Matt was a successful businessman. He and Henry Miller, who owned the Minnie Moore mine, owned the Bellevue Racetrack, the Bellevue Water Company. And in 1893, the Falls moved from Bellevue to Shoshone because the International Silver Depression shut down mining in the Wood River Valley. Shoshone was still thriving as a railroad center, and they built the McFall Hotel across from the railroad station that's pictured here. That structure is still there if any of you drive through Shoshone. Isabel's brother, actually whole family moved here. Her brother Neil was the patriarch of the Campbell family. He had the first blacksmith shop in Bellevue, which is pictured here. This is Neil and his wife and two sons, taken later. And he had a livery stable and blacksmith shop just south of Oak Street. And this is Neil and a couple of his sons. And the Campbell family had extensive land holdings, ranches and farms. They owned 41 silver mines over the years. And Neil's son, Stuart, was the elected Idaho Inspector of Mines in the 20s and 30s. And his son, George, was the Blaine County Sheriff in the 20s and 30s. So we go way back. As Kristen said, my project with my brother last decade or so has been researching and writing about the history of the Wood River Valley. We're ultimately going to publish a book about it. But in the meantime, I've written a whole series of essays on individual history topics that are available at the community library, the Center for Regional History. I've done a series of lectures that are available at the community library website, and I've started doing a series of history TV shows with Eye on Sun Valley TV. The three that we did this year are the history of the Philadelphia Smelter, Geyer Hot Springs, and then ski jumping in Washington, in Sun Valley, the history of Rude Mountain. So those are available if you haven't seen them on the Eye on Sun Valley website. Let me just spend a few minutes on the first book that I published in July of this last year, Sun Valley, Ketchum, and Wood River Valley. This is an Images of America book that's History Press, my main publisher, and Arcadia Press are part of the same corporate group. They asked me, actually, I was lucky when I was writing my first book, History of Washington, which was published under the name Early Skiing on Sun Valley, on Snoqualmie Pass. They asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about Sun Valley. And I said I would look at it, although I was dubious because so much had been written about Sun Valley already. And when I looked at it, I realized that there was a niche that I thought wasn't covered quite enough. And that was Sun Valley's relationship with Averill Harriman and the Union Pacific, and how Sun Valley was never a standalone ski area, but it was an economic asset of the Union Pacific Railroad. So that was the primary focus of my history of the Sun Valley Resort. And this is a much smaller book. It's 127 pages. It's part of their Images of America series. It's basically history through pictures. It has 200 historic pictures of the Wood River Valley. Most of them are from the Center for Regional History at the community library, although I put in a number of family pictures as well. And it really traces the economic history of the Wood River Valley from the early days of mining into the International Silver Depression, where mining was replaced by sheep raising and agriculture. And those were necessary, as I mentioned before, both to bring the railroad into the Wood River Valley and to keep it in operation. And that was critical to the formation of Sun Valley, because in 1935, when Averill Harriman sent Count Schafgotsch to tour the West to look for the best available place for a new ski area, destination ski resort, it had to have the best combination of weather, snow, and hills, but it had to be on an existing Union Pacific line. So it took all those factors in the economic history of the Wood River Valley to maintain that rail line. It was critical to ultimately building Sun Valley here. There are 200 pictures. Let me just give you a very short version of what it's like. The Galena ore was first found here in 1879. A flood of prospectors came in after that. There were 2,000 claims filed by 1880, and in 1881, $1 million of silver was produced here. But it had to be shipped elsewhere for smelting, and this is how it worked in those days. You can see the mules dragging the wagon. The first key element to the economic development was a smelter, because galena is a combination of silver, lead, and zinc. It had to be broken down and the silver extracted. You needed a smelter, and that was built in the Wood River Valley in late 1881. Philadelphia investors put up $500,000, which is an extraordinary amount in 1881. And they built the Philadelphia smelter that was located on the start of the Wood River, of the Warm Springs Canyon. This is a picture of it. This is actually the Big Wood River here, and here's the Warm Springs Creek. And they had 300 acres west of the Big Wood River and 1,000 acres east of it. So they had a huge complex, and that was the largest industrial enterprise in Idaho for many years. Sun Valley and the Wood River Valley were isolated and remote. And the only way, even with a smelter, to get the processed silver out was by wagon to one or two railroad centers. The main route was from the Wood River Valley here south to Kelton, Utah, which was on the main east-west Union Pacific, Central Pacific line. That was 170 miles. The other route was to Blackfoot, Idaho, that picked up another branch line to the Union Pacific called the Utah Northern that went up to Butte. So that was very expensive and cumbersome. So really what they needed was the railroad. So that came a few years later. The Union Pacific Railroad built a northwest connection between 1881 and 1884, connecting its east-west route from Granger, Idaho, through Granger, Wyoming, through Idaho along the Snake River Plain, and then along the Columbia River into Portland. And the key for the Wood River Valley was that in 1882, Union Pacific was convinced to build the Wood River branch into here to access the silver. And there's a man called Robert Strayhorn who was instrumental in that. He was a publicist for the Union Pacific, and he helped scout out the potential routes. So he knew the exact route that the Union Pacific was going to take. He convinced UP to build the Wood River branch, and he formed a corporation called the Idaho and Oregon Land Improvement Company to buy land that he knew was going to be developed as a railroad stop, develop it, and make large profits from that work. And in 1882, in June, his company bought the town of Shoshone and the town of Haley, because they knew that was where the railroad connection was going to be. Spent $100,000 for the township of Haley, as well as the two large ranches, the Croy Ranch and the Quigley Ranch. And he intended to make Haley the terminus of the Wood River branch and the center of the economic development of the Wood River Valley. It's going to make it transition into the Denver of Idaho. So in May of 1883, the Wood River branch was finished, and it connected this remote valley in the mountains of Idaho to the outside world. The cost of transporting people and goods dropped dramatically. The time was very, very fast, and it caused an economic boom here. A flood of outside capital poured in, and mines were bought and sold and rebought, and some were sold between $500,000 and $1 million within a few years. And again, this is 1882, 1883 dollars. You can see some of the statistics here. Wood River Valley, 1881 produced $1 million of ore, 82, 2.5 million, 3.5 in 83, and it went up all the way to 9.2 million in 87. That's a result of the railroad coming here. If you're looking for remnants, you can obviously our wonderful bike path and recreation trail is the main remnant. But here's the only sign that appears in the city of Haley. It's on the bike path between Croy and Bullion. And it's a wonderful little sign made by the community school a few years ago that commemorates the railroad. And that was a sign of, the sign is located where the Haley Depot was set. There's one problem. The largest customer of the railroad was the Philadelphia smelter, which was located north of town, north of Ketchum. They had to put all the smelted ore on wagons and take it to Haley, which is about 14 miles, and didn't like that. So there's a battle between the people, the investors who were making Haley the Denver of Idaho, and the smelter as to whether the railroad would be extended. Well, the smelter won. In 1884, the tracks were brought up actually through the town of Ketchum, directly into the Philadelphia smelter that was located north of town at that point. You can see the railroad tracks went directly into the smelter there. And this picture here shows smelted silver bars ready for pickup. And so basically Strayhorn's company lost, and the economic development flowed north, and the area around the Philadelphia smelter was incorporated into Ketchum at the time. This shows you a map of the Oregon short line. This is the main east-west Union Pacific route here. This is the Oregon short line going through Idaho and Oregon, and the Wood River Ranch going to Ketchum. So that was the key to the economic development of the Wood River Valley. But as we all know, Idaho has been on a roller coaster of economic development over the years, boom and bust. The next thing that happened was bust. The International Silver Depression started in 1888 and lasted till 1898. And it shut down all the mining in the Wood River Valley. Most of the railroads in the country went into receivership and bankruptcy, including Union Pacific and the Oregon Short Line, which was its subsidiary it used to build this Northwest connection. And the Wood River branch was almost shut down because there was no more business. But what rescued it was sheep. That was the big economic area that started in the late 1880s. And pretty soon there were hundreds of thousands of sheep that were transported in and out of the valley. And that really rescued the railroad. And the next thing that happened was the Reclamation Act 1902 that provided a huge amount of federal funding for dams and irrigation projects in the arid West. And a flood of money came into Idaho. The dams were built along the Snake River and along the Bigwood River, Magic Reservoir. And this is a picture of Magic Reservoir and dam being built right here. And that caused huge increase in the traffic for the Oregon Short Line coming up from the new farms. This is actually on the left here. This is the Ketchum Depot right there with sheep ready, waiting to be shipped out. And there are pins to load or facilities to load the sheep onto the railroad cars there. So again, this kept the railroad in operation into the Wood River Valley in spite of an agricultural recession in the 1920s. And again, that was critical to the development of Sun Valley in 1936. So two things. Number one, the fact that it was brought into the valley in the first place was critical. And the fact that it was extended from Haley up to Ketchum in 1884 was critical. Because when Schafgott ultimately came into the Wood River Valley, he didn't like the territory up through Haley. He thought it was boring and had no potential for a ski resort. It was only when he got up to Ketchum that he fell in love with it. So again, that extension up to Ketchum and the maintenance of the railroad through the economic depression was critical to the formation of Sun Valley. This is another map. All these are from the book, by the way. This is what Shortline looked like in 1918. And here's the Wood River branch here. And you can see all these other branches that really were formed after 1902 to serve the new agricultural towns. So that had a huge impact on the railroad business. Now we're going to turn to skiing Sun Valley. This is a serious history book. It's a hardback. It has over 180 pictures in it. Again, most of the pictures are from the community library and the center. I should say that I am donating my author's profits from both books to the Center for Regional History. So if you're interested in buying a book, you're not only getting, I think, some interesting books, but you're making a donation to a wonderful facility in the valley here. I dedicated it to Warren Miller. He actually died shortly after my first book came out. And he was a big influence on me as a kid. And we used to see his ski movies every fall. That was the beginning of ski season in Seattle. And I fell in love with Sun Valley without ever going here by seeing wonderful films from this resort that he would show us every year. Of course, he's famous for living in a teardrop trailer in the Sun Valley parking lot. A few sources that I used, I say a few, I did some fairly extensive research in here. Again, I used the facilities of the Center for Regional History, and which are marvelous. They have 12,000 historic pictures and 2,000 of Sun Valley from the early days from Union Pacific. They have a lot of Union Pacific documents. They have files of Doris Taylor, who was the longtime publicist. They have the Valley Sun, which was a local publication, Sun Valley Ski Club annual reports, and American Ski Annuals. And they have a wonderful contemporaneous description of all the races held throughout the years and all the improvements done to Sun Valley and the ski hills. Another treasure trove of marvelous information. They have over 500 oral histories of a whole variety of people. Avro and Kathleen Harriman, Union Pacific personnel involved in both building and operating the Sun Valley. And key here is Ed Siegel was the chief engineer for Union Pacific, and he ran Sun Valley from 1936 till 1965 when it was sold to, after it was sold to Jans. And they actually have 5 different interviews of him. And people like Charles Proctor, Sun Valley ski instructors, heads of the ski school, just a myriad of people were interviewed. And I drew a lot of information from those because they have marvelous contemporaneous descriptions of what happened in Sun Valley in the early days. And I really fell in love with them. Of course, there are 4 great books of Sun Valley that I'm sure many of you have. But there are a lot of other books too, written by famous people who played roles in Sun Valley here. And they have some wonderful descriptions of their experiences here. And I listed a few of them, from Otto Lang to Friedel Pfeiffer, Dick Durrance, Vincent Fraser, David Niven, Mary Hemingway, Warren Miller, and even the gonzo journalist Hunter Thompson had some interesting things to say. I depended a lot on serious history books about about Union Pacific. Maury Klein is their official historian. He wrote a 4-volume history of Union Pacific that's detailed and marvelous. He also wrote biographies of E.H. Harriman, Averill's father, and Jay Gould, who was an early financier of the Union Pacific. And there's only one biography of Harriman written by Rudy Abramson that, again, is excellent and traces most of his life. But some of the critical information I got came from files I got from Maury Klein himself. I never met him. I got his email address online, like we can these days. And I sent him an email, told him about my project. And I asked him if I could have access to some of the Union Pacific documents that he uncovered during his 40 years of research. And he was wonderful. He said, absolutely. He set me up with his archivist, and who said, absolutely, we have a banker box and a half here. Do you want me to Xerox the material or scan it and send it to you in digital form? So I said, well, the latter would be great, thank you. And that provided terrific insight into that relationship of Averill Harriman, Union Pacific, and Sun Valley. And I owe a big debt of gratitude to Maury Klein. You can't understand Sun Valley without understanding the Harriman family. And you can't understand Averill without understanding his father and the relationship he had. And E.H. Harriman was a remarkable person, and many of his personality aspects and business acumen was passed on to Averill. He started out in 1897. I mentioned that the International Civil Depression caused the bankruptcy of virtually all railroads. In 1897, E.H. Harriman led a group that bought both Union Pacific and the Oregon Short Line out of bankruptcy. And over the next decade and a half, he refinanced it, expanded it, and turned it into probably the most powerful transportation empire in the United States. And he became one of the world's richest people as a result of that. He actually acquired Southern Pacific, joined the two of them together, had a Trans-Pacific steamship line, and he controlled 5 railroads, Western Union, and was on the board of directors of 59 companies, a truly remarkable man. And according to Klein, he did much more than just expanding the railroad. He reinvented railroading, and he brought 20th century operation procedures into a 19th century institution. And he was called the man who saved railroads by Maury Klein. And when he each died in 1909, he had an estate of around 70 million, which is roughly 12 to 42 billion now. And that he was clearly one of the world's richest persons from his work with principally the Union Pacific. And Averill got into the Union Pacific really as a matter of family inheritance. He worked out west, including in Idaho, on the survey crew when he was in high school. And he was put on the board of directors of Union Pacific when he was at Yale in 1912. And in 1914, 2 years later, at age 22, he was made the Union Pacific vice president. So he was clearly born into a leadership role, and he played it well. Incidentally, at Yale, he was an amazing sports person. He both rowed, was on the Yale crew, and was on their polo team, and continued with polo for much of his life. That was one of his principal recreational activities. He wasn't satisfied with just living off his inheritance of Union Pacific. During World War I, he moved into maritime business. He had some of the biggest shipyards in the United States during World War I. And after the war, he formed the first transatlantic company, steamship company. And by the age of 29, he was the most powerful figure in American shipping, because he realized if he wanted to establish his own reputation, he had to do it outside of the railroad. He was well known for his investments. He had his own investment firm, W.A. Harriman, with his brother Roland. They had another firm, and he invested in Europe substantially after World War I. He dealt with some of the largest industrialists. His financing enabled Germany to make many of its reparation payments that it owed from the war. And in 1924, his firm got a concession for manganese from the Russian government in the country of Georgia. And he got to know Stalin, both Lenin and Stalin, quite well in those days. And that relationship carried over into World War II, where he was ambassador to Russia after 1943 to the USSR, and used the decades-long relationship with Stalin in that particular facility. It's important to understand the significance of the economic might of the railroads in the 1920s. In 1927, there were 10 US corporations with assets over $1 billion, and 5 of them were railroads. And Union Pacific was the largest of those railroads. So this was the single most powerful, or certainly one of them, powerful companies in the world, in the country. But the Depression hit in 1929, and like many other companies, it was a disaster for railroads. Klein said that the railroad industry collapsed like a rotten trestle, and rail passenger traffic fell 50 to 70%. Its stock was devastated, and its annual income collapsed as well. And so Averill was brought in a rescue mission. In 1930, he had been on the board of directors since 1914, but he was made chairman of the board of directors in 1932 with a mission to rescue Union Pacific from the depths of the recession. At the time, this was not his only venture. He was on the board of directors of 52 major national corporations, partner in Brown Brothers Harriman, that was formed after the Harriman financial firms merged with the Brown Brothers. And that was one of the largest private banks in the country at that time. He was also on the board of Illinois Central Railroad. He's chairman of the board. So here is a man with tremendous talent and huge ambition, and he was brought in to rescue Union Pacific. He did 2 things. One, he invested in a whole new concept of railroading, and they were known as streamliners. They were aluminum rather than metal, lightweight, diesel powered rather than coal or steam, air conditioned, fancy, and they were really designed to bring a whole new class of people into railroad travel, and it worked. And according to Klein, they weren't mere transportation; they were sophisticated means of transportation, rolling hotels and restaurants, and riding them was a gala affair. And they had observation cars and a bar that was much like the parlor of a gay 90s madam. And this is just one of their cars. And this is one of the streamliners that, again, revolutionized passenger travel. And more important to Sun Valley, he realized that he was bringing more people back into railroad transportation, but they needed a place to go, particularly in the winter. And it was his idea based on experiences he had working as an international banker in Europe and seeing all of his banker friends and industrial friends go to on ski vacations in the winter. He thought we need a destination ski resort served by Union Pacific in the Western United States. And he decided on his own to do that. And as we'll see a little later, he had the power to do that given the authority he had as chairman. And he basically went ahead without fully disclosing to the Union Pacific or the Union Pacific board what he planned to do. And we're sitting here in what he accomplished. But keep in mind, this was 1935 when he was making these plans. It was a huge risk. Skiing was a fledgling sport. Ski jumping was the most popular form of the sport, but very few people skied. There was some development of the interest in skiing from the 32 Winter Olympic Games in Lake Placid, although that was only Nordic skiing. Alpine skiing didn't really start to come into favor until the mid-1930s. And two things that were important there. One, in 1935, the first national championship was held on Mount Rainier, and that was also the selection process for the 36 Olympic team for the US. And then the Olympic teams held in Garmisch, Germany in 1936 were the first Olympics where alpine skiing was part of the offering. Up to that point, it had only been Nordic skiing, which was ski jumping and cross country. But again, very few people were alpine skiers in this country. And the ones that would go alpine skiing, there were no destination ski resorts. The local ski areas, none of them had lifts. So this was a big gamble for Harriman and Union Pacific, but he basically wanted to do it, so he did it. There's information about the ski industry here. The first rope tow didn't appear till 1934, and 1935 was the first J-bar and overhead cable. But beyond those, there were certainly no destination ski resorts, and local ski resorts had no amenities, and relatively few people skied. So this was a big gamble. And as I mentioned, he never really told Union Pacific what he was going to do. He just told them that he wanted to explore whether there might be at some point a destination ski resort in the West that Union Pacific could serve. And he thought he would send his associate, Count Schafgauss, around to see if something like that could be located, never indicating that he really planned to build a resort. These are just some of the things I mentioned that created the new interest in skiing. Lake Placid, New York, 32 Olympics, ski jumping only. This is the program from the National Championships on Mount Rainier in 1935 that put not only alpine skiing, but Washington skiing on the map. This is the downhill route, which was an uncontrolled downhill from about 10,000 feet down glaciers to 5,500 feet. And that's the emblem of the 36 German Olympic Games. So we know a lot of the rest of the story here. He had known Count Schafgauss from Europe, and he brought him to the United States and had him tour the West looking for the best place for a destination ski resort. But he had specific criteria. It had to be far away from centers of population. He didn't want it overrun with weekend crowds. And again, the critical element, it had to be served by an existing Union Pacific line, which further restricted the potential areas. And Union Pacific personnel escorted the Count through 6 states in 6 weeks, starting in November of 35. The first place he went actually was Mount Rainier, because he thought, based on the 35 tournament there, that was a likely place. And this is actually a picture from the Seattle Times of the Count when he was there exploring the skiing on Mount Rainier. And the Count went to virtually every ski location of where a ski resort was later organized. And he rejected all of them for various reasons, whether it's weather, altitude, climate, snow. Interestingly enough, the one place he found that he really liked was Jackson Hole. And he really explored Jackson Hole and thought that might be a suitable place. But the problem was you'd get there from Victor, which is in eastern Idaho. You had to go over Teton Pass. And the Idaho Department of Transportation wouldn't guarantee that they would keep Teton Pass open all winter. So that made the development of Jackson Hole Resort impossible. But imagine if they had been more cooperative with the Count, we might all be sitting in Jackson Hole right now instead of Sun Valley. And the last place that the Count went was Idaho. And he had a tour guide who showed him various places in eastern Idaho and again, the Tetons. And he didn't find any of them acceptable. So he concluded that there was no place in the West that would be suitable for a ski resort for Union Pacific. And he was actually got on a train to go back to New York to tell Harriman that it was impossible. But there was really another one of those ironic occurrences that happened. And his Union Pacific guide had dinner the night that the Count left with a friend who worked for the Department of Highways. And the highway guy said, "Did you show him Ketchum in the Wood River Valley?" And the Union Pacific person said, "I forgot." And he recalled at that point that it took more money to keep the line open into the Wood River Valley than anywhere else except the Yellowstone route. So he called the Count back. They came into the Wood River Valley after a few days. It was snowbound, so they had to actually open the line. And he fell in love with it. And he said, "This is the most delightful features for a winter sports center than any other place I've seen in the United States, Switzerland, and Austria." So again, some of those historic circumstances, we might have ended up in Jackson Hole if something else happened. And if that his Union Pacific guide hadn't had dinner or drinks that night with the highway guy, he wouldn't have ever seen this. So again, all these historic anomalies that had to happen for us to end up here. So Harriman actually came here and visited and fell in love with it himself. This is actually a very rare picture of Harriman's party. He came with William Paley, who was president of CBS, and both of their families. And that's actually Harriman and Paley exploring with skins on their skis the area around Sun Valley. And he came on February 18th, Washington's birthday, fell in love with the area, and decided right then and there he was going to create a destination ski resort that would open by the following December, which was an incredibly ambitious agenda. So he went back and created his ski resort. But again, as Klein points out, the Union Pacific Board and the operating staff were never enthusiastic about Harriman's idea. But he put the bit in his mouth and went, charged ahead. And as Klein said, it was built with a grudging acquiescence of the railroad. And the Union Pacific executives sought to convince him to forget his resort and stick to railroading, but unable to stop him, they loyally fell into place, and Harriman built his resort. Two people that he had that played critical parts in forming the resort were Charles Proctor and John E.P. Morgan. Many of you know, I'm sure, Peggy Dean, who lives in the Valley. Charles Proctor was Peggy's father, and Peggy was kind enough to provide some great pictures and other material from her father for me. And both of them had extensive backgrounds in skiing and had worked both as skiers and administrators. Proctor was on the 28 Olympic team, both as a jumper and a cross-country skier. And they did an economic analysis of skiing for Harriman beforehand. And they basically located where the ski runs would go, and they scouted cross-country skiing and backcountry skiing for Harriman. That became a big part of his offering. Harriman worked with blinding speed, and as soon as he went back, he had Union Pacific lawyers buy the Brass Ranch. He hired an architect, Gilbert Stanley Underwood, signed a contract with McNeil Construction Company, but most importantly, he hired Steve Hannigan, who was a brilliant publicist, and Hannigan wrote the design for the ski area. He actually told Harriman the size of the resort, the size of the hotel, what he had to, how he had to structure it. And that was the plan that Harriman followed. All of this happened between the end of February and everything that set Sun Valley into motion happened before Union Pacific even approved the idea. It wasn't until May 5th that the board of directors met and approved the money that Harriman had already spent to build Sun Valley. And even there, on May 5th, there were many uncertainties. It wasn't clear whether Harriman and a group of friends would build and run it, or Union Pacific would. And Union Pacific board said, well, it had to at least carry itself financially, which of course we know it never did. It took operating subsidy of at least $250,000 to $1 million every year to keep it going. And as Harriman said, that was okay. We didn't run it to make money. We ran it to be a perfect place. And the publicity, he thought, was worth much more than the deficit. I have a map of all the Sun Valley land purchases and a description of them that people can see. This is Steve Hannigan, who is a brilliant publicist. He created the plan that Harriman used for Sun Valley. And one of the things he said is mechanical devices must be installed to carry people to the top of the slides. And of course, he came up with this idea of winter fun in a summer sun. And this is the publicity poster that he designed that was used for so many years. We all know that chairlifts were invented here, created by a Union Pacific engineer, Charles Curran, who adapted a method of loading bananas onto ships. Charles Proctor was the one who really chose that from a variety of options, told Harriman that was the way to go, and that was what was installed. As we may know, the chairlifts were only installed on Dollar and Proctor Mountain when Sun Valley opened. Baldy was seen as far too challenging for the average skier, so chairlifts weren't built there or installed there until 1940. And one interesting footnote is Charles Curran, who is now regaled as the inventor of the chairlift, never considered that to be part of his mainstream of his work. Their benefits were limited to the rich, and he said they were about as useful as a carnival ride. And he was much prouder for some of the structural engineering bridges that he created. Well, Sun Valley was built for about $1.5 million. It opened in December of 1936, and it was the life of luxury in the remote Idaho mountains. It's It had amenities that you could only find in a place like New York. Saks Fifth Avenue ran the ski store. You could buy fresh orchids. And for people used to servants, they had valets and ladies' maids in waiting available to provide whatever services you wanted. So Sun Valley opened with a flash. Hannigan created huge publicity mechanisms. A couple things he did. He had Union Pacific photographers take pictures of everyone who came from every city and then send those pictures back to their hometown newspapers, and they would always be published. So they got huge amounts of publicity all over the country for free. The Life magazine publication in March was famous. They got 8 pages of pictures and text, and Sun Valley became this cultural icon very quickly.
John, I just, excuse me for interrupting for just a second. I just wanted to let you know you have about a half an hour to go. And there may be some background noise coming from your room. I don't know. But I'm hearing a little bit, I heard a beep there a little bit ago, but just to let you know.
Okay, the beep was probably our dinner being cooked as we speak. Harriman was 100% involved in Sun Valley. He took more pride than virtually anything else he did his whole business career, in spite of all the different things he did. And Klein basically said for 5 years, he was totally involved to the extent that he was involved in every decision, large and small. Whenever there's repainting, samples had to be sent to him first for his approval. He dictated the precise location of furniture, the Durton room, and had it changed if he showed up and it wasn't where he wanted it. That was a kind of fastidious attention to detail that he played. And he became quite a good skier. And Klein said that, and Aberson, his biographer, said that skiing replaced polo in his life, and he became quite a good skier. And he personally said, no one has really lived until you've skied. In 37 was summer of 30, in December of 36, the only thing that existed was the Sun Valley Lodge. 37, the summer, was when the big expansion took place. The inn, the village, the railroad, a rodeo facility was installed. The Trail Creek was dammed. The lake was formed. So that's really when Sun Valley was expanded to the resort we know it today. Union Pacific, that had approved $1.5 million the year before, approved another $1 million for all those amenities, plus another $65,000 for the rodeo. And so the Sun Valley that we know now really took place in summer or fall of 37. Another very interesting thing I found is that Harriman was really promoting not only access by railroads, but access by airplanes. He was an early investor in the aviation industry. In the 20s, both his and his brother's firm invested in the fledgling aviation industry. He had Union Pacific in the 30s buy United Airlines stock and looked into having the railroad actually acquire the entire United Airlines at one point. And he had Union Pacific and United Airlines coordinate their schedules to come to Sun Valley. And you can see one example of this here, ads that were announced joint United Airlines, Union Pacific routes there. And that was a surprise to me because we always associate this with the railroad. But as a matter of fact, he was really pushing the development of the aviation industry at the time. Um, One of the critical things he did to bring Sun Valley, to make Sun Valley the skiing center of the world, was using tournaments, and he brought in the best skiers from Europe to teach in the ski school, and he used his tournaments, particularly the Harriman Cup, as a major attraction to bring the best racers in the world. And the big advantage that Sun Valley had in 36, 37 was a chairlift. And no place else in this country had chairlifts that could be used for race training as well as recreation skiing. It was said that to become an international racer, you had to get in at least 10 to 15,000 feet of vertical down here skiing a day. And if you climb up to ski down, as they did everywhere else in the country, you could only get 4,000 to 5,000 feet a day. So it was the chairlifts that enabled Sun Valley to really become the center for not only recreation skiing, but serious competitive skiing. And all the US Olympic teams for the 40 Olympics that were, of course, canceled, and 48 and 52 Olympics, both trained in Sun Valley and were selected here. Of course, the Harriman Cup tournaments were the best known, and they were the country's most prestigious and best known ski races. The American Ski Annual in 43 said, just as it was the dream of every tennis player to compete at Wimbledon, it's every skier's hope to participate in the famous Harriman Cup races at Sun Valley. Dick Durrance, the Dartmouth College skier, made his debut and his reputation skiing at Sun Valley. The Harriman Cup in 37 was the first truly international ski race. The best skiers from Europe and the United States skied here. And this college kid, Dick Durrance, beat them all to everyone's surprise. And the downhill for the first two Harriman Cups were held north of town, what is now known as Durrance Mountain, behind the SNRA headquarters, because none of the Sun Valley hills had enough vertical, neither Proctor nor Dollar. And of course, you had to climb up the hill. It was a 3-hour trek up the hill, and you could see them going up the hill before you could ski down. And Durrance won in 37 and 38, and here he's getting the famous Harriman Cup from Averill's wife. And it was said that it took 3 days for the first racers to reach Sun Valley from the east, 3 hours to walk up the course, and 5 minutes from Durrance to win it. That was what it took to be a successful ski racer in those days. Another little known fact is that Harriman put in ski jumping in the summer of 37. In those days, the competitive skiers were 4-way competitors, downhill, slalom, cross country, and jumping. And since Harriman wanted to make his resort the center of competitive skiing, he had 2 Norwegian jumpers, Alf Engen and Sigmund Ruud, locate and design a facility for ski jumping. And in summer of 37, Ruud Mountain, that was named after Sigmund, was put in. They created a ski jump from the natural terrain of the hill. They put in a rudimentary chairlift, and Ruud Mountain became the center not only of ski jumping, but for slalom race after that. And this is Alf Engen riding the very primitive chairlift that existed there. And of course, you can still see the old Ruud Mountain ski area as you drive out Fairway Road out toward Proctor. Alf Engen, by the way, was hired by Harriman, and he was one of the best known and best competitive, both Nordic and alpine skiers in the 30s and 40s. He's best known for his work at Alta, Utah after 1948, but he really did most of his competitive career here at Sun Valley, competing for the Sun Valley Ski Club. Another great facility, another great tournament was a college tournament held between Christmas and New Year's every year, where Sun Valley brought in all the best college skiers, gave them free room and board and coaching, and it really started them out and brought them up into where they became national and international skiers. These are a few pictures from the 38 Harriman Cup. These are from Durrance Mountain. Here's Dick Durrance finishing and winning the downhill. This is him skiing on Rood Mountain. And this over here is a very young skier from Tacoma, Washington, Gretchen Kudik, who in 1948 won a gold and silver medal in the Olympics as Gretchen Fraser. She had married Don Fraser from Seattle at that point. And does that look like the skiing technique of a future downhill gold medal winner? Things were pretty rudimentary in those days. For the 39 Harriman Cup downhill, Dick Durrance actually scouted out and located a very steep, narrow downhill course down Warren Springs that we used in 39 and 40. 39, you had to, again, hike up to the top of Baldy to ski down. And it was said it was more like a giant slalom course than a downhill with 24-inch fir trees as control gates. And when the chairlifts were put in 1940 on Baldy, the downhill was held either on Warren Springs or the river run side. It would go back and forth. These are just some of the national and international ski races that were held every year. Again, Sun Valley was the center for national and international tournaments over the years, and including training for the Olympic teams and the selection of the Olympic teams for 48 and 50 or 52. I spent a lot of time talking about how important backcountry skiing was for Sun Valley during its early days, because again, most skiers in those days were backcountry skiers. There wasn't such a thing as lift-served areas. So that was a big part of the offering in Sun Valley. They had, Proctor and Morgan had scouted out extensive backcountry skiing. These are some early maps from Sun Valley that showed where the backcountry skiing took place. Galena Summit and Baker are off here, but they showed Boulder Mountain, Durrance Mountain, Bright Mountain, what was called Race Mountain between the North Fork and Eagle Creek, Hauser Mountain, up Warm Springs Ridge and skiing down into Warm Springs, backcountry skiing on Bald Mountain, and of course east of, this is Proctor and Rood, and east of where the controlled skiing area was, there was extensive backcountry skiing too. And of course, Pioneer Cabin was built in the Pioneers. They actually had snow tanks from 38 on to take people backcountry skiing. And they built 2 backcountry huts. Pioneer Cabin is on the left. That was in the Pioneers. It was about a 5-mile hike to get into it. Owl Creek Cabin was built in 1940, and that was north of Ketchum, about 3 miles south of Galena Lodge. And both of them were, you could spend as much time you went there, they would, the Sun Valley instructors would take you in. Sun Valley would send a chef to cook your meals. And so this was backcountry skiing with Sun Valley polish. There's a lot of description of how important gambling was to Sun Valley in the early days. There were 8 or 10 different gambling places in Ketchum. You can see some of them. This is the main street in Ketchum, a night view. There was the high-end facility was a Christiana, owned allegedly by a member of the Detroit mob. This is organized crime in Sun Valley. This was on Sun Valley Road, and Christianity was closely tied into Sun Valley. Dutch Schultz, who owned and operated it, lived in the lodge. Whenever customers or people checked into the Sun Valley Lodge or Inn, they got invitations to the Christianity. And more importantly, if you had large gambling losses at the Christiana, you could sign an IOU, and that would appear on your Sun Valley bill as you're checking out. And Daryl Zanuck, the movie producer, was known to lose up to $100,000 a night. Sun Valley itself actually was directly involved in gambling. They didn't have craps or poker, but they had slot machines, particularly after World War II. And Ed Siegel says that it was enormously successful money-wise. They would earn up to $41,000 a month from their slot machines. And they reported those earnings as through their, to Union Pacific, through their game department. And their game department had 2 bowling alleys and some pool tables. And of course, Union Pacific didn't know about the gambling, the slot machines, and they were mystified how Sun Valley could earn $41,000 a year from pool and bowling. Well, we know that Baldy was open for skiing in 1940, dramatically changed the offerings. This is the original design of it. Many of us here probably skied Sun Valley when the chairlift, the beginning of the chairlift was east of the Bigwood River. So we had to, on single chairs, ride over the river to get up to the first lift station. And it really changed the skiing offering significantly here and dramatically improved it. World War II, Sun Valley was a Navy rehabilitation center. So it provided significant input into the war effort. And there were some 8,000 to 10,000 sailors that were treated here. So it really was an important institution. And there was actually, the first movie was filmed here for the mountain troops. Was filmed here at Sun Valley by Daryl Zanuck and Otto Lang. World War II changed things. Harriman started his war service in 1940 and served overseas for the whole war, both in England and later Russia. And when he came at the end of the war, he became Truman's Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and had to give up his management position with Union Pacific. So he was never really involved with Union Pacific management nor Sun Valley after World War II. And so the fate of Sun Valley was put in the hands of Union Pacific railroad professionals who never really cared for it much. And it's not well known that Sun Valley almost didn't reopen after World War II because of what it would take to bring it back up to offering the lifestyle that it did before the war, given 4 years of use as a hospital and the continuing issue of the yearly subsidy. but Steve Hannigan convinced them that they should. But he said, if you're not prepared to subsidize the endeavors, advertising, and goodwill from at least 350 to 500,000 a year, you should abandon it. Well, they decided to do that, and they reopened, but it really wasn't the same. The heyday of before World War II was never recreated. More middle-class people came, and they catered to a different group of people, and they promoted convention business. So even though it continued to be the outstanding destination ski area, it started to change. Nonetheless, it was still the center of skiing and racing. Here are the 48 and 52 U.S. Olympic teams that were selected here. Gretchen Fraser being here, and Ketchum Jim Griffiths here. Gretchen won the first skiing medals of any American athlete in 1948. And we'll jump ahead. In the 50s, things changed because of Harriman's being gone. And railroad business continued to drop, particularly the passenger traffic. So you can see it dropped by 61% by 1949. And rail passenger was really seeing its end in the future because of increased competition from cars and air travel. Union Pacific got a new president in 1949, someone never liked by Harriman, said he never would have hired him if he'd still around. But it continued to bring Hollywood stars, people like Warren Miller and Ernest Hemingway, who came back. 52 was an important year. There was a terrible avalanche that killed 4 people on the mountain. And the longtime manager, Pat Rogers, left, and the whole ambiance of Sun Valley changed after that. And Union Pacific hired someone whose only job it was, or main job, it was to slash the subsidy. The Union Pacific, Sun Valley continued to have the world's best skiers teaching at a ski school. Here we have Christian Pravda and Stein Eriksen and Jack Reddish, a U.S. Olympian, who taught here in the 50s. And Sun Valley was still the center of skiing. And its Harriman Cups continued to bring in the best skiers in the world. Some of the names are listed here. And, Pravda was here. He taught here for at least a decade. And he was one of the best downhill skiers ever. And in 56, he killed the downhill, or went down exhibition. And it showed he was one of the greatest stars of the year. But in 57, Tony Seiler came here and beat Pravda by 8 seconds, which was an astronomical amount in a downhill. But again, all the stars of the 50s, 60s, and 70s skied here. There's Pravda on the right, and Buddy Warner, who skied here for a decade before he finally won the Harriman Cup in 53. The end of Union Pacific here was 64, when the Jans Company bought it from Union Pacific. Doris Taylor said, Union Pacific dumped us. It was controversial. Harriman didn't like it. He said if was still around, never would have bought it. But Jans bought it. And he was a longtime skier. He skied here in the 40s and actually made the 40 Olympic team. But each of the transitions, both to Jans and later Holdings, it disrupted things because it brought an entirely new philosophy of management in. And there's a great deal of local unhappiness when both of the changes in regimes took place. But once they saw Jans significantly invest in the mountain and the skiing, he became a beloved figure. Jans bought it in 77 for 12 million. Bill Jans realized that he didn't have enough money to bring Sun Valley up to the next level, and he was delighted to find someone with the financial resources like the holdings. And the holdings, again, there was a rough transition because their management philosophy was much different than Jans's. But once people saw what they did for Sun Valley, and they've done an extraordinary job for Sun Valley, they become truly beloved figures around here. The investments they made in the mountain, the lodges, the snowmaking, the new lifts, and remaking the physical plant made them, again, truly beloved people to Sun Valley. Resulted in Sun Valley being ranked the #1 ski area in the country this year. The opening of the wonderful area of Sunrise is kind of the recent crowning achievement. Let me just end here quickly by Avro Harriman's death. When he died in the 80s, he was such a public figure that virtually every major newspaper in not only the country but the world had extensive obituaries about him. They described many decades of public service, working with every president from Roosevelt through Johnson, and the significant contributions he made to the country. What's interesting is that his public service record was such that Union Pacific was barely mentioned in any of his biographies. And Sun Valley was only mentioned in one obituary. The Washington Post merely said, in the late 30s, he developed Sun Valley, Idaho as a world-class ski resort as a means of expanding his railroad business. So here we are, owing Avro Harriman such a great debt. We see him as this giant figure sitting here in Sun Valley, and what he had done in both his business and political career afterwards was so overwhelming that his contribution to Sun Valley was virtually forgotten. That's all I have. A lot more information in both books, and you should enjoy them.
Well, thank you so much, John. Feel free to stop that screen share. Interestingly enough, no one has posted any questions for you. I think they were so riveted by what you said and those fascinating historical pictures. So if anybody has questions, maybe raise your hand so we don't kind of talk over each other, and then I can call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask a question of John while you have him here live and in person.
I would say that I gave you about maybe 5% of what's in the book. So there's a lot more there, and far more pictures than I had the opportunity to show tonight.
And I will mention, because I forgot to say in the beginning, that we are recording this, and I will do some light editing, and in probably just after President's Day, I'll send it out with a resource list. And so I know some people told me they could only be here for part of the talk, or maybe there's a slide you really want to dive into and read it in detail. So you'll be getting that. If you signed up for this talk, you'll be getting that follow-up email. So does anybody have any questions? We're getting a lot of comments, terrific videos, interesting talk, fantastic job, thank you. So a lot of folks who are maybe don't have a question, or they have to leave us here. So any questions for John? All right, then. Well, thank you so much, John. And like I mentioned before, your book, Skiing Sun Valley, is available at the Haley Public Library, and the Sun Valley, Ketchum, and
Wood River Valley.
Wood River Valley book is available at local bookstores and the Ketchum Library.
Yeah,
So
they're for sale all over the valley. And thank you all so much for your attention. And we all love this place. We've all committed much of our lives here, and I learned an awful lot researching and writing this book, and I hope I've given you some new insight into this wonderful place where we live.